Hey guys, this is OMG Clado for Deuces Cracked. This is my first video series for Deuces Cracked and I'm really excited to be a part of the team. I really hope that you guys are going to enjoy this video series and also learn a lot. This series is going to be all about how to crush the 180-man turbo sit-ngos and poker stars. The title of this series is the top 0.56%, and as some of you may have already figured out, this title refers to the winner of 180-man turbo sit-ngo, since first out of 180 players is the top 0.56%. So, I know that's really creative. The goal of my series is to get you guys into that top first spot as often as possible, and ultimately achieve a higher ROI and win rate. This first episode in the series is mostly just going to be an introduction, which covers a lot of the basic concepts relating to the games. For most of you, this will probably be rather remedial, but in any case, the basics can always be compared to the foundations when building a house. Without the floor, you can't have a roof, and so on. So firstly, what are these games? Well, as already mentioned, the game this series will focus on is my specialty, which are the 180-man turbo sit-ngos. They are basically tournaments with 180 players. Well, where are the games? Poker Stars. Who will play the games? Well, you guys, of course. When will the games be played? As soon as possible, really, if possible. I recommend you guys to play as many games as possible, as often as possible. After watching each of the videos in this series, think about what I talked about, play some games, and try to apply what I talked about when applicable. Finally, why should you play these games? Well, simply put, profit. These games are very beatable and good money can be made for anyone who puts in some decent effort and time. As you can see, there are 5 different buy-in levels for the 180s, including Rake, $2.50, $3.50 with rebuy and add-ons, $8, $15, and $35. This range of buy-ins allow for a pretty decent plan of moving up. Anyone can play the $2.50s, grind the games, learn and improve, and eventually begin to include the 8s, $3.50 rebuys, 15s, and even the 35s eventually. In terms of actual skill, the lower buy-ins, like the 8s, and especially the $2.50s and $3.50 rebuys, definitely have a lot more fish and the general field is a lot softer. However, the $15 level is still definitely beatable with a field full of fish, and also some players who are maybe okay at poker in general, but don't really know how to adjust to the structure of the 180-man tournaments, possibly like some of you may be like at the moment. And finally, the 35s, as hard as it may be to believe for some of you, are actually also very beatable, and in terms of actual skill level, on average they're actually very similar to the lower buy-in levels as well. Anyway, let's have a look at the actual structures of these games. Players start with 1500 chips, and as turbos, the blind levels increase every 5 minutes, as you can see on the screen. After the first 30 minutes, antes start to kick in, and as we'll talk about, it's really important to adjust accordingly once antes start to kick in, as it's going to strongly affect what our ranges should be and how we should be playing in general. And finally, it's also probably worth mentioning that these games have a 5-minute break at the end of each hour, like PokerStars scheduled MTTs do. Anyway, on the bottom left, you should be able to see a little extra info for the $3.50 rebuys. Sorry, that's the bottom right. You can rebuy as much as you want at the price of $3.19 for 1500 chips in the first 30 minutes, provided you have 1500 chips or less. Because of this, you can actually rebuy before the first hand, and effectively start with a stack of 3000. After the rebuy period, you can also add on 2000 chips for $3.19, and simply put, you should definitely rebuy for the maximum whenever you can. You should always take the add-on as well. The rebuy and add-ons are also not raked. This is just a side note I thought I should mention. This basically means that you should always rebuy before the first hand to start with 3000 chips, and always rebuy when we fall below 1500 chips or bust, and we should do that for the maximum. If we bust, we can rebuy or double rebuy for 1500 or 3000 chips respectively, and you should definitely always take 3000 rather than a single rebuy for 1500. Again, always take the add-on at the add-on period. We want to maximize our EV by playing deep versus players who we have an edge over. We should always take the rebuy regardless of the current blind levels, and simply put, with decent shoving ranges and knowledge, as you guys will have, especially after the series, the expected value we have of the prize pool will always be greater than the money we pay to rebuy with. As you guys may have already figured out, this does mean that the $3.50 rebuys will have a relatively higher average buy-in. I would estimate around $10 to $12 depending on your playstyle and of course variance. The $3 rebuys do have a few differences, most of which I've already mentioned. Because of the rebuy and add-ons, players will on average be deeper. This means a few things. The bad news is that the average time taken for these games will be a bit longer, since people are on average a bit deeper, and the blind structures are actually the same as the other 180 turbos. The other possibly bad news is that since we're deeper, some of you may also find it a little bit confusing to adjust to the larger numbers, like for example dealing with hundreds of thousands of chips, sooner than you normally need to. especially compared to the other 180s, and especially if you're multi-tabling. This isn't really a massive deal, and I'm sure you guys will learn how to adjust. The good news, however, is that because we are deeper with players on average, that again, on average we have an edge over, our expected value in terms of ROI, or return on investment, is going to be greater. In poker, in general, the deeper you are with someone that you have an edge over, the higher your EV will be. This is no different for the $3 rebuys. Also, many fish who buy in without taking the rebuys on add-ons, or even fish who do, will of course get very lucky and deep. When they make these later stages, you'll basically run them over and it'll just mean a lot of money for us. A fish who 3 times raise folds with 10 BBs, or limp folds when the blinds are bigger than the starting stack. So what I mean by that is, like, if the blinds are, say for example 2,000, 4,000, and the starting stacks are 1,500 or 3,000 if you rebuy, they're just going to bleed a ton of equity. Fish make these mistakes all the time at all sorts of levels, but especially when they get deep, the actual expense of their mistake in terms of equity is going to be much larger, and we're going to capitalize on that basically. So again, since we're deeper, our edge is going to be a bit bigger than what it would be in the other 180s, especially considering that we're relatively shallower in those games. So yeah, I mean, when you're deeper, your edge is always going to be bigger than if you're shorter. Because, for instance, if you have a 10 big blind stack, I mean, there's not really much you can do. You can shove optimally and exploit other players for being too tight or calling incorrectly in general, basically. But whereas if you have, say, 20 big blinds instead, it's not necessarily a huge difference, but basically you have more moves in your arsenal. For example, you can do things like raise fold, raise call, and your reshoving ranges will be a lot better than weaker players' ranges will be. So therefore, basically there's more spots that we can capitalize on, and our edge is gonna fall through in those spots. So let's talk about the price structure. The price structure, as you can see in the top right, are the numbers for the $15 games. The percentage stays the same for each buy-in, so first is 30%, second is 20%, and so on. Including the $3.50 rebuys, which obviously have different price pools each game, depending on how many rebuys and add-ons were taken. As you can see, the price structure, like most MTTs, is extremely top-heavy. Therefore, we're looking to essentially get to the top spots as often as possible, and ideally first. As you can see, a min cash is basically 2 buy-ins, whereas a first place is much higher and pretty much 50 buy-ins. So obviously, if you think about it, we're aiming to reach these top spots as often as possible because the money is basically mostly at the top, as you can see again. So let's talk about the attainable ROIs. This will largely depend on your skill, which of course I hope to improve dramatically with this video series, but also, of course, how many tables you're playing, since if you're playing, for example, 4 tables, then you can probably concentrate better and think about each spot properly compared to if you're playing, say, 20 to 30 tables, if you're maybe trying to maximize your hourly by playing more tables. Of course you're going to make some mistakes or suboptimal plays just because you're playing so many tables, and it's hard to play perfectly when you're playing so many tables. And that's fine, because I mean, generally speaking, the reason you should be playing poker, sorry, I'll rephrase that. The reason most people are playing poker is to make money. So therefore we should look to maximize our hourly, and that's the money we make per hour, rather than our ROI. So again, we'll talk about this a bit more in detail later, but basically you want to play the number of tables which will maximize your hourly, and usually that does mean that your ROI as a percentage is going to be a bit lower per game. But your hourly will again, which is the money you make per hour once again, will be higher. So also, it probably depends on what time you play. During the off-peak times, which will depend on where you live, there are relatively few rigs playing since the games load so slowly. The peak times are generally the early evening to late night of the European time zones, and especially during Friday and the weekend the games load much faster. Generally I wouldn't recommend playing during these times since the games load so slow. As I said, that is the off-peak times. So unless you're learning, you're just learning, or you find it difficult to play a lot of tables anyway, especially at the beginning, it's probably not worth your time compared to the peak times where you can load 30 plus tables if you wanted to. Anyway, during the off-peak times, just due to rigs playing less, or less rigs playing, because of the reasons we just discussed, because they can't load as many tables, it's probably not worth the time compared to the peak times, etc. Attainable ROIs will of course be a bit higher during these off-peak times. It's also very hard to be accurate for the true ROI of these games in general, just because of the massive variance. If you think about it, the average player will win 1 game in every 180 times, of course. But if you're a good rig, and you have a true win rate of winning one of these games 1 in every 100 times, and by the way, this is just a completely random example, that's 1% of the time. Imagine spinning a wheel with 100 sections, and only one of those sections being, say, blue, which represents winning. Every other color is basically represents not winning. And if you spin this wheel many times, if you think about it, that's basically exactly what winning a 180 man sitngo is all about, assuming you do win exactly one in every 100 times in the long run. We of course get money for second to 18th place too, but I'm just trying to illustrate a point about how massive the variance is. As you can see on the screen, I've put a rough range of the attainable ROIs for these games in their respective buy-in levels that I think is very realistic for decent play multi-tabling. I think that you guys can definitely safely aim for these games, especially after watching the series. As you can see, for the 250s, I would estimate somewhere between 30 to 60% being very reasonable. Of course, the lower end is going to be easier to achieve compared to the higher end, but the higher end is also definitely possible for all of you in my opinion too, especially after watching the series. Anyway, for the 250s, the percentage I gave equates to roughly 75 cents to 150 a game on average. For the 350 rebuys, which have an average buy-in of around $11, I think that an ROI of 50 to 80% of your total money invested, including rebuys on add-ons, is very reasonable. The percentage is a lot higher than the other buy-ins because in addition to the fields being very soft compared to the other buy-ins, we're also deeper, as I mentioned. The drawback is that the games will take longer, but because we're deeper, our retainable ROI will be higher, as reflected in my estimates. So therefore that actually equates to roughly $5.50 or $8 a game. The 8s around 15 to 30%, and that's 120 to 240 a game. The 15s 10 to 25%, which is 150 to 375 a game, and finally the 35s 10 to 20%, which is $3.50 to $7 a game. Also, bear in mind that the rakeback equivalent is worth considering too, as it will in the long run make a reasonable impact on your hourly. This obviously depends on how you spend your bonuses and what VIP level you are, but you're looking at around 7 cents for 250, 9 cents for 350, 20 cents for an 8, 35 cents for 15, and $1 for 35. Now the average game takes around 45 minutes. Obviously sometimes you'll bust in the first 5 minutes, other times you'll win, but these games take around an hour and 40 minutes to finish. So that includes getting to heads up and hopefully winning. Again, this will be more relevant once you're capable of mass multi-tabling, but if you want to estimate your hourly, you basically want to multiply your expected winnings by the number of games played, then divide it by the total number of hours played. So it's important to realize that generally the more tables you play, the higher your the higher your hourly will be. But let's think about when you start a session and have fewer tables due to the games taking time to load before you can have the the preferred number of games or tables up. Also think about the end of the session when you're finishing off, and you have 5, 4, 3, and eventually 2 and 1 tables left. Both during the start of a session and the end of a session, you're actually playing less tables than you're comfortable with. So during the start and end of a session, your hourly will technically be lower than the rest of the session. This means ideally you should play a longer session when possible, since it will, barring any issues of playing too long and being stressed, etc., mean a higher average hourly. This is actually something that many people don't really consider, so I just wanted to mention that. So again, at the start of a session and the end of a session, you're playing less tables than you would be comfortable playing, and therefore, again, a short session will have a lower average hourly. I'm not going to go into the detailed calculations, but generally speaking, the maximum attainable hourly for these games, including rakeback and bonus equivalent, is around $70 US. $40 is very attainable, and $50 to $60 requires you to cap tables and basically play well. I should make a note that this is assuming you will eventually be able to play at least 20 tables simultaneously, and probably more. In my opinion, for most people, this is definitely very learnable, and it simply takes practice. It's something that I will work on in this series, to help you guys, basically be able to do this. And in general, it's probably easier if you play maybe computer or video games, and also just in general if you're young. That being said, the first step is for sure to actually work on your game before thinking about playing more tables. And as they say, long-term greed is far better than short-term greed. I think this is extremely important, so again I'm just going to say it. Long-term greed is far better than short-term greed. At the start you should just be focusing on your game and then eventually add more tables. Again, we're going to talk about ways to multi-table effectively, including options and also software. When I say options, I mean tiling, stacking, and so on. Just by the way, just to further illustrate and talk about the variance, here are 4 graphs of some of the better winning 180-man players. You probably can't see it, but these guys have had huge upswings and downswings of 300 plus buy-ins and many swings of 100 buy-ins. Similarly, they've also had massive upswings and sections of 1,000 games where they were making an obviously unsustainable 100% ROI. So again, this is something I just wanted to mention again, but the variance is very, very big. I mean, these games are great, they're very profitable and so on, but again, be prepared for some pretty massive variance. Anyway, let's talk about software that I would recommend for using if you don't already, or at least looking into it and considering it. In no particular order, I would suggest having a subscription to SharkScope or using official poker rankings, since this will help with taking notes and labeling regulars, and just our decision making in general. SharkScope does cost, but generally, if you're looking to play this seriously, I'd say it's worth it for most people. Not just for using on opponents to determine who's a regular, but it's also a great way to track your own profits and so on. I would also definitely recommend PokerStove. This is a free download that you should be able to find simply by googling PokerStove, and it basically allows you to determine the equity of a specific hand or range of hands versus another hand or range of hands, or multiple other hands or ranges of hands, either pre-flop on the turn, on the flop, on the turn, or the river. It's something that I would say is quite useful in general, especially when you're learning, since knowing what kind of equity hands have is by itself going to be very useful. For example, if we put King 2 offsuit versus any two cards in PokerStove, you'll see that King 2 offsuit just has just over 50% versus any two random cards. Therefore, if we know a regular is shoving any two cards on us, blind versus blind, for example, we can call King 2 offsuit, especially because of the dead money and subsequently the pot odds. Anyway, next I would recommend getting, or at least checking out and downloading a trial of sitngo Wizard. This software is basically excellent for most push or call or fold spots and is generally useful even for other sitngos and of course MTTs. I personally didn't use this whilst I was studying, but now that I know more about it and I've used it during coaching sessions with students, I can confidently say that it will definitely help improve your game and help you learn faster, assuming you actually use it, of course. It does cost around $100 US though, so it's like an investment, but I think it's a very good investment, and it will definitely help you for your game, and it will be very useful to have in general. And for instance, you won't have to post hands on 2+2 or deuces crack, simply asking if you should shove or call or shove, etc. Since sitngo Wizard can basically do the calculations for most of these things. Next, I would say you can consider getting Universal Replayer. This isn't as important as the rest of the software I recommended, but it's again a free download that most poker players should have, in my opinion. It basically allows you to look over hand histories, and I think for reviewing sessions, it's quite important and definitely helpful. I'll be using this throughout the series, as well as PokerStove and sitngo Wizard. Next, I'd recommend Table Ninja. At the start, especially when you're learning and focusing on your game rather than playing more tables and your short-term hourly, it's not that important, but when you're at the stage where you feel like your game is already solid or pretty decent and you're looking to play more tables, Table Ninja will definitely help. It does things like automatically time bank for you, automatically sit back whenever you sit out, automatically register for games for you, and also have default bet sizes and raise sizes, which will save you a lot of clicking and ultimately time. You can even set up hotkeys and such, but for example, you can make a button on your mouse or just the key on your keyboard, represent fold, shove all in, or call for you, etc. I'm not 100% sure yet, but I'll likely do a quick explanation of how you can use Table Ninja to multi-table later in the series. Finally, one of, if not the most important things that pretty much all poker players in general should have, is a HUD or heads-up display. Either Hold'em Manager or Poker Tracker are fine, and you can download a free trial. I would say that you should definitely buy a full version of this eventually, and the price is definitely worth the investment in the long term. If you don't already know, a HUD tracks the hands you've played and can display stats about you, and more importantly your opponents. The most commonly used stats are VPIP, which stands for voluntarily put money in pot, so basically literally what it sounds like. It's a percentage of hands a player chooses to play a pot with by putting money in by either calling or raising pre-flop. And PFR, which is another common stat, and this stands for percentage of hands raised pre-flop. Again, it literally means exactly what it sounds like. So the other stats that you can use vary, but include things such as steal, the percentage a player raises from the cutoff or button, and the number of hands, just so you can be aware of how relevant the sample size is of the stats, and a few more. Those are the main ones though. So a HUD will basically help you a lot with making your decisions, and a lot of spots are hugely dependent on our opponents, especially when we're multi-tabling and we don't really get to see exactly what our opponents are doing necessarily all the time. A HUD really helps with that. So unless we're playing one or two tables, we really are seldomly able to develop reads on players, and the HUD basically just makes our lives a lot easier. If a player is ridiculously loose, or if a player is ridiculously tight, it's going to make a huge difference in what play is the best in general. So that's a brief introduction of using a HUD, and this series isn't really aimed at explaining that in huge detail. That being said, I will try to cover everything that I think is necessary for 180 players, and again, a few of these things such as this and using Table Ninja and stuff, I will try to cover at some later point in the series. So let's quickly talk about bankroll management. there are a number of considerations that we can talk about. Generally, we can talk about bankroll management in terms of the number of buy-ins for the games we play. And for the 180s, of course, it matters which buy-in or buy-in levels you are playing. Generally, a good idea is to kind of average it out. For example, if you're only playing 250s, then obviously your average buy-in is 250. Whereas if you're playing 15s and 8s, your average buy-in is probably around $10 or $11. Not 23 divided by 2, since the lower buy-ins tend to load a bit faster, especially true for the 250s. So that's to say, if you're playing 15s and 8s and you're loading both of them, you probably will, be playing a bit more 8s than 15s because they load a bit more. Also, in general, the higher the buy-in is, the more buy-ins you should generally have to be safely rolled, and this is because the attainable ROI is going to be gradually lower at the higher stakes, as I showed earlier, and therefore the variance will be larger in terms of how often we go on downswings and so on. So a few other things that need to be considered. For example, can you reload if it's necessary? If you went on a big downswing and went bust or nearly bust, is it possible to simply top up more money? This is important because if the answer is yes, generally speaking, it's going to be more acceptable to play with a smaller bankroll in terms of the number of buy-ins we have. We can be a bit more aggressive with our bankroll management and enjoy a higher expected hourly in return for basically taking some risk. Similarly, you should consider if you're willing to move down in stakes. If again, things go badly and you don't run very well. Simply put, again, whilst the money in these games is very good, the variance is very high, so you're gonna have to basically be willing to accept that you definitely will go on downswings at some point, no matter how good you are. Some people really hate the idea of having to move back down in stakes, and if this applies to you, you probably want to be safer with your bankroll management. Just quickly, on a somewhat related but also tangential topic, tilt control, like with all forms of poker, is very important. If you tilt and let your emotions get to you, it's gonna hinder your progress. And again, downswings happen to everyone in the 180s, especially in these games, but with so many pre-flop all-ins and shoving and so on. But there's going to be days where you just can't win damn flip. Aces never hold, ace-king suited loses to ace-king offsuit all in pre-flop and stuff like that. And it's impossible not really to care at all, but really you have to try your best to not let it get to you and just move on. Because you basically don't want to turn a mediocre session into a bad session, or a bad session into a terrible one. Anyway, as a general rule, 100 buy-ins is an acceptable but very aggressive bankroll management strategy in general, due to the fact that 100 buy-in swings are somewhat common. This obviously isn't too safe, but it's going to be okay if you're playing the 250s, where your ROI is going to be a bit higher, and it's also going to be, for most people, easier to reload at this level. At higher buy-ins, people are usually mixing games, and I would say for most people, a minimum of 200 of your average buy-in is recommended, and probably more like 300 plus if you're playing the 15s, especially with the 35s included, and especially if you don't want to move down and stuff. For example, if you're playing 350 rebuys, 8s, 15s, and your average buy-in is going to be around $10, then you're going to be looking to have at least $1,000 in your bankroll, and probably definitely more, or almost definitely more, to be on the safe side. So that's all the content for this introduction video, and I hope that helped you guys and you guys learned something new. Look out for the further videos in my series, which are obviously going to go into more detailed concepts in relation to beating the 180s. I'm just quickly going to mention coaching for any of you who are potentially interested. I do private coaching, and I'm currently offering a pretty heavily discounted rate of $100 for the first 3 hours for any new students as a special for a limited time. After that, the standard rates will apply, although further discounts are actually negotiable. I've done quite a bit of coaching recently to several Deuces Crack members, and I've received 100% positive feedback to date. A few of them have already posted reviews, but the others have written them to me via email or Skype, and I haven't posted them yet, but I will soon. References are also available upon request, obviously, and my sample size may be on the smaller side, but I've done a pretty decent amount of coaching, as I've said, and like I said, with 100% positive feedback. And my graph is on the left for any of you who are interested. My only full-time student to date, so that is someone I've basically coached for a long term, is someone that I also backed, and he's done very well, and his graph is on the right. He's actually played more games than me now, so that's kind of a shame for me, but oh well. So just for all students, after the first hour, if you didn't like it, or you felt that my style doesn't suit you, or you didn't really learn anything, or basically it just wasn't worth the money for you, you can be honest. That's no problem at all, and I'll give you a full refund with no issues at all. So coaching methods vary by students, but most commonly we use Skype and screen sharing software to go over hand histories of yours. Sometimes students prefer to go over hand histories of mine, which is also fine, of course, and in general we're going to be talking much more about actual situations within a hand history rather than the hands themselves, because it's obviously much more important and beneficial to your game if you know what ranges to go over in a particular situation, rather than the actual hand itself, because it's obviously not much point of me saying, oh, you should have called the shove with aces, or you should have folded to the shove with 6-2 offsuit or something. It's, you know, obviously going to be much more beneficial for you in the long term if I tell you that your range here should be this, your range should here should be this, and what variables are going to change this range. Yeah, so any potential students are also more than welcome to ask me any questions between sessions at no extra charge. Like if you send me some hands or whatever on Skype or email, that's no problem. I'm happy to answer them for free. And also I don't clock watch, so the average 1 hour session often goes to more than that, and you know I don't charge extra for that either. That's no problem. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to send me a PM on Deuces Cracked or email me at fishandchipspoker@gmail.com, or you can just simply add me on Skype, which might be the easiest. OMG Clado is my Skype name, and yeah, I mean, maybe if it's easier, just it might be easier if you just, you know, maybe mention something about Deuces Cracked just so I know who you are when you add me, but you know, that's no big deal, obviously. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching, and see you guys soon. This is OMG Clado with the top 0.56% for Deuces Cracked, signing off.